So basically, in this next panel, we're going to talk a little bit more about some different scenarios, different solutions, approaches to FHIR that have been taken. So we have a couple of panelists that I'm going to introduce in a moment. And then we're going to talk also a little bit more about FHIR and Carequality. The prior panel started to allude to that a little bit, and what we are going to be talking about. So FHIR, new standard by HL7 out there, and is really helping to extend on the interoperability capabilities that we have. We have version 2, we have NCPDP, we have documents, we have other methods out there, but FHIR really was created to help extend on the opportunities to interoperate in a variety of different ways, to get better at getting the right data to the right person at the right time, at the right amount of data. So where in documents some of the comments that have been made are about large volumes at times, CCD has been at times promoted. FHIR, frequently the discussion is right, smaller data sets, very targeted queries otherwise. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those different variations are that one can do with FHIR, and that it helps to extend effectively the area in which we operate. Typically the standards that we have talked about and the opportunities in interoperability are across providers, payer to providers, other stakeholders, research, registries, but now it's very exciting to also get another constituent into the picture more, the consumer. It opens up opportunities that with existing capabilities have been challenging to do, and we get into that space. So, and with the advent of internet technologies and otherwise, we have seen is that existing standards are not up to the task to get some of the data in the way that is consumable for these new capabilities. You take your preferred phone, you do a search on a map, and you will start to see that these apps are pulling data from different places all over the map. But in order to do that, and typically in a RESTful environment, the construct of how the data is represented needs to be somewhat different. V2 couldn't do it, CCDA cannot do it, FHIR was targeted to actually be able to do that. So lots of opportunities that we have as a result out there. And that means that for us, Carequality, the question is, how is that going to play with us? What are we going to be able to contribute? What should we contribute? So in that context, I want to introduce the panel members across the area, because they're going to share a couple of their experiences in FHIR, and also include some very interesting and unique environments that we are now able to talk about as well. And I think there is a little bit of a slide that we can push. So here we go. I can look there too. Okay. Yeah, monitors everywhere. First, we'd like to introduce Ken Meyer, sits on the far right. Ken is the CEO of SAFE. SAFE is an organization company focusing on sexual health care and leveraging advanced technologies and innovative marketing techniques to disrupt the spread of STDs and modernize sexual health practices to empower young people to play a more proactive role in their personal health care. They have a SAFE app. They're working on a couple of different solutions in that space to help that community, that environment, and improve on the abilities to manage and address some of their healthcare questions. Ken has a very broad experience in a number of different backgrounds: entrepreneurs, marketing, technology-enabled businesses. He has worked as a founder and CEO for GTV. It's a digital media company. A widespread of other knowledges in branding and marketing capabilities. So an excellent example of some of the new different angles that we see entering into this space, and focus very strongly on the consumer environment. So Ken's extensive experience in developing technology companies and leading brand strategies for some of the world's most recognized companies positions SAFE to reach mass adoption and quite possibly disrupt the spread of STDs in our lifetime. So very interesting, unique focus and area, and Ken will share a little bit more about that. Then we have Andre Sudin. He sits right next to him, CTO of Health Gorilla, co-founder, Chief Technology Officer at Health Gorilla, a career of progressive achievements in computer science, particularly software development, applied expertise and leadership to further shape Health Gorilla and its secure, interoperable clinical network of patients, physicians, hospitals, laboratories, and healthcare organizations. His background includes development of large-scale customer service environments for Fortune 500 companies. John Deere, Home Depot are included in there. He has a PhD in computer science from Moscow State Institute of Electronics and Mathematics, and multiple patents pending in the area of data integration. So a different angle that we're going to get from him. And lastly, Doug DeVore, on the immediate left, Director Enterprise Interoperability at Matrix Care. He started over 25 years ago in the long-term and post-acute care with a multi-facility skilled nursing chain. Strong promoter of standards-based open APIs so that providers have better information and patients receive better care. Frequent speaker at industry industry events, and he is the past president of the National Association in Support of Long-Term Care and served on the CCHIT Advisory Task Force and the HL7 Long-Term Care Functional Profile Work Group. He's a current member of the Carequality Advisory Council and an active member of the FHIR Tiger team in Carequality that started to set up the use case and the charter of where we might be heading. As it might come up here and there, I might not only ask some questions, but maybe I might answer some as well, or jump into the conversation. My background is with Cerner, worked with HL7 and a couple of industry organizations. I'm active in Carequality from pretty much the beginning, I think. So looking forward to see where we can have a conversation around how to move forward with FHIR and how that works within Carequality. So with that, I think the first to speak, I believe, if we go to the next one, yep, Matrix. That's Doug. And then I think you have one slide, but then can pass it along.
Thank you, Hans. It's good to be here. I think these guys are the exciting guys this afternoon. Matrix Care is the largest long-term post-acute care software provider, all the way from home care, independent living, senior living or assisted living, skilled care, and a lot of ancillary products that support all of that, installed at somewhere around 14,000 different locations. And we have kind of gotten into FHIR mostly for our own internal use. So for instance, we're really focused on 3.0, the 3.01 version, because we wanted to solve some of the problems that we see with the CCD, for instance, that was just talked about in the last panel. I only want to get the last A1C, right? I don't need the history of every observation. And this really became obvious to us because a major part of our client base is CCRCs who have had histories on people for years. One encounter, right? And so an encounter summary would have 5, 6 years worth of data, and when Dr. Lane gets that, I'm sure he's not interested in weeding through 13,000 pages of stuff just to get the last A1C, right? Or to see the last progress note. So we started working on FHIR when somebody said, gee, couldn't we do something besides this SOAP XML stuff, right? And I said, well, there's FHIR, and we had to go through all of those conversations about what that is. And so we see a lot of promise in being able to enable our own, but on the other hand, we're about to release our first use of FHIR with our partner No2. Alan's back over here. Be sure to ask Alan how it's going to work. Where No2 will actually use a FHIR patient search to actually search our EMPI. Do you know Floyd DeVore? And can I get some records for him? So that's straight out of the No2 application. So those are some of the things that we're doing to try to make this work.
Great. Thank you. Ken.
Hello. So we're Safe. We're a national virtual healthcare company. We have physicians licensed in all 50 states, and we're initially hyper-focused on the sexual health area. We started out with a pretty simple premise originally, which was create an app that allowed people to show their verified STD status on their phone. STDs have reached an all-time high in the U.S. for the 4th year in a row. It's at, epidemic sort of levels, and there's 140 million sexually active people in the U.S. alone that are facing this problem. So as we dug in to try to actually accomplish that simple premise, we inadvertently had to create what we're calling an integrated virtual healthcare platform. We started by doing deals with Quest and LabCorp and interfaces into their hubs, which was using HL7 and a Mirth open source that we took hold of and have been sort of customizing, bastardizing ourselves. That gave us about 30,000 different facilities across the country that people could book and schedule testing through the app. Then we wanted them to be able to use their insurance, so we realized that in order for them to use their insurance, it had to be requisitioned or prescribed by a physician. So we essentially built out this national healthcare company that's owned technically by our medical director, and then kind of slave to the parent through a management services agreement. And from there, we needed to get data. Essentially, the physicians said, we don't want to just be randomly prescribing, these patients testing without knowing if they just had that test. And we didn't want to put the patients in a position of having their insurance claim denied because they had just been tested for something or had already been tested for a chronic infection that obviously isn't going away. So it's redundant to test them again for that. So that's when we met Dave. We started looking into, how do we get these patient records? And at first it seemed like something that was logical with web services having been around for 20 years, that of course the healthcare industry had a way to let these patient records fluidly move between providers. And then we quickly realized that that wasn't the case, and it was kind of our naive sort of perspective into this, into this industry. So as I started looking around to see, how do we overcome this challenge? Because it seemed like it was a real key component to pulling off the mission. So when we found Sequoia Project and started talking to Dave, I was first time I was introduced to FHIR, and that was, I was just amazed really at what it did. And ultimately we had to, as a next step, build out our own EHR and kind of interaction between the physicians and patients that was all HIPAA compliant and managing all that data. And some would say even the most sensitive of healthcare data with people's sexual health records. So we actually built our EHR using FHIR resources. So we kind of almost backed into the EHR by looking at these data sets and having that, basically piecing our EHR together, through that. So we now have a non-SQL and SQL database. It's all built in .NET Core, microservice architecture running in the HIPAA cloud. And yeah, that's a little about us. Our plan is to ultimately expand within the sphere of sexual health and then ultimately much more broader. Personally, I'm very interested in ways to sort of reduce costs within healthcare. I think it's sort of the only way that we're going to solve some of the problems we're facing now, especially as, the issues with, Obamacare potentially getting, taken away and there being tens of millions of more people uninsured. It seems that, access to data is going to allow us to create automation where human intervention, doctors aren't really necessary in the value chain and can be replaced with, just basic scripts, not even AI. So I'm really interested in how FHIR is going to be applied to that kind of movement.
Thank you. Andre?
Yeah, thank you. So we're Health Gorilla, and we are the clinical network that empowers healthcare organizations like ACOs, IPAs, MSOs with real-time data aggregation, clinical workflow management, and like business applications on top of the platform, like analytics. One more slide, how we do this, and like on a technical perspective. So we use like multiple APIs, including FHIR, to read and to extract data from the participants of the network, like laboratory and imaging vendors, clinician EMRs, hospital systems, So various APIs are used to retrieve this data, FHIR, HL7, proprietary APIs. Then this data is aggregated on the platform. Before it is stored, we clean it, deduplicate, and normalize so that it is readily available for use. And on another side of the spectrum, we have partners who are building the vertical solutions, various clinical workflows, right? And also we provide our own analytics on top of this data aggregated platform for healthcare organizations. And this is where we mostly use FHIR as a FHIR endpoints to provide data to consumers through FHIR API.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for those introductions. And what it shows as well is that we're all at different stages of starting to use FHIR. And that's where one of the first questions is that what's your experience with FHIR as it's available now? It's going through a progression. The standard is called Standard for Trial Use, which sounds like it's draft, even though a lot of progress is being made. From your respective ways of trying to apply that, what's the state of maturity? Where do you think you are at, and what are some of the challenges moving that forward using FHIR? And maybe start from left to right on this one with Doc first.
I got two ways to answer that, I think, Hans, is that state of maturity, I would say Matrix Care, we're immature at this point as we get into it. I think as we look at Draft Standard 3, we think it's pretty darn close, right? It'll be interesting to see how in Carequality we apply, for instance, access assertion, policy assertion to that. But as a standard, seemed pretty darn good, right? It's based on the HL7 reference information model. So folks who've been working with the 2.x or the 3.x, the CDA, will probably do what I did. Okay, which pipe does this fit in, right? And that's actually kind of how we started is, but now what we saw there is I didn't have to train developers how to read pipe delimited things or how to work through the convoluted CDA structure and be able to get down to just discrete elements that they were familiar with as Java developers in name value pairs, right? And I only needed a patient identifier section and I needed the other thing that I wanted. If it was observations, that's all I had to go get. I didn't have to do all of those other segments, right? So that was the thing that we saw with FHIR that we're working with. And so we, interestingly enough, even though we were trying to solve the problems of being a little more granular internally on things like medications and observations and allergies and reactions, our very first real implementation that went live recently is on the FHIR appointment schedule. The ability for our home care software to schedule appointments that show up in our care coordination platform using FHIR. Okay? And likewise for the care coordinator to, in that patient provider facing portal, be able to schedule appointments back into the home care using FHIR. So we think it's mature enough to go. We're just kind of getting our feet wet before we say to the rest of you, hey, we're open for business.
And are you, as part of that, actually using the base standard, or are you using any implementation guide that might be out there, to, for example, US Core, Argonaut, or whatever, to make that work?
Yeah. Anybody that talks to me knows that I'm a standards freak. But we have found that there's some extensibility that we need to do. For instance, in the patient resource, I need to get multiple identifiers, just the reality. I need to have multiple identifiers, and we had to come up with a way to identify our enterprise unique ID that we assign to a patient, right? But otherwise, I think it's okay, Ken. Yeah.
Andre, what's your perspective on where we are? Far enough, ready to go, or still some areas that you'd like to achieve that you say that no, standard has still a little bit of a way to go?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are, so there are several things here, of course. Like internally in Health Gorilla, we are like running FHIR Release 3, and we are already experiencing some fragmentation with the version fragmentation with partners who are running version 2. They are not like directly backwards compatible. So even though there is like a clear upgrade path, it still needs to be done by engineers, sometimes on both ends. So, and moving forward to version 4, it doesn't look like things getting easier. So that's one thing. Another thing, like FHIR is very extensible standard, right? You can, which is beauty and the beast. If something is missing in the standard, you can go ahead and create it in like a FHIR fashion and make it available through like metadata endpoint. But it also means that these custom resources or extensions to the existing resources require some additional time for like to implement by the partners. So this is like another challenge that, and also the beauty and the challenge of the standard.
So I'm hearing a little bit of, yes, we are starting to get far enough with the kind of data that is in there, but the variations that we have across the different participants, there's still, I'm not sure whether it's too much or some out there that says, no, we still have challenges now connecting with different people consistently. Ken, is that something that you're running into as well, or what other things that you see is that FHIR is there enough or not enough to make your solutions move forward?
We're starting to talk to a lot of the bigger healthcare systems about ways that we can sort of play a role in driving users to them or patients to them in the context of building awareness around sexual health. And I think really what SAFE's going to do, and you know, on the marketing side where we're aligning with a lot of celebrities and social media stars, is sort of drive people and create awareness that, you know, patient-centered or patient-directed, if you will, which I know is kind of a bad word in some circles, but you know, care, where they're going out and asking for these things and taking care of themselves. And we do that in, you know, basically creating FOMO, fear of missing out, of desirable opportunities, you know, if you're not sort of taking care of yourself. And it's creating more consequences, you know, in an atmosphere where partners demand transparency. There's a lot more consequences of getting a chronic infection, herpes or something like that. So because of that, it's sort of, and some of our board members opened up some C-level conversations with big healthcare systems, and you know, I asked them about FHIR and whether they're participating in Sequoia Project, and the answer generally is, yeah, we love it, we want to move towards it. You see the engineers, if they're in the room, saying, we can't wait to, you know, fully implement it. They seem to all have skunk work projects playing with it. I think SMART on FHIR will probably be sort of the first way that they'll start interfacing with that community, it seems like. But so far, we haven't done any implementations with it, you know, other than, again, using it as a design mechanism for our EHR, you know, essentially sort of dictating data sets for how we built that, and then, you know, working with Sequoia Project and Carequality. I know that our engineers are very happy to be using it compared to the HL7 interfaces they did to Quest and LabCorp. And for me, as a non-engineer with just enough technical knowledge to be dangerous, I can actually look at the JSON. I like the fact that it's human readable and I can participate in the process a lot more than I could with HL7 that looks like a bunch of gobbledygook to me. So I think that's a value in that, you know, the business-minded people that understand the sort of use cases for both the patients and the business side have been sort of alienated from software development up until now. And, you know, with JSON and with this, it's, you know, it's allowed me at least to participate more and have a more, I think, meaningful impact which has also sped up development because they don't go and do something wrong and then go, oh, now we have to go back and change it because it doesn't really meet the business case.
So how should
version 3?
Don't know. It sounds naive. I don't really know. Whatever Dave suggested, or Eric actually suggested.
Okay.
So how in that context, and starting with you, Ken, how do you see Carequality help your kinds of solutions and the community in this new FHIR space to achieve better connectivity, better interoperability that we have? What's your perspective? What are your expectations on what a Carequality can and cannot do to move the ball forward there?
I mean, I think fluid access to patient records is fundamental to the next paradigm of healthcare that, essentially we're stepping towards and need to do in a fairly expeditious way, before we bankrupt the country with the costs. And I think what it's going to do is not only provide, just better outcomes from traditional medicine where you have clinicians dealing with patients, but I think it's going to engage patients a lot more, and it's going to feel less like this fuzzy hall of mirrors where they don't know what's going on behind the curtain, so to speak. And I think it's going to get them more involved in a positive way. And I think nobody knows your health or cares about it, or your children's health or your parents' health as much as you do. So once you're given tools, and I think your patient record is one of the fundamental tools. It's the hammer or screwdriver. Like, you can't really build the rest of what needs to happen, with this new paradigm of healthcare without it. So I think it's going to usher in, all kinds of things that we can't even imagine, from, research studies that are allowed to use, for anonymized data to find patterns, leveraging AI and different things like that, that's going to go a long way to solving some of the problems. And then I think the treatment of them, it's going to reduce the cost and the hassle for people that have them. And I'll give one quick example. Currently, there's 30 million people in the US that have HSV2, genital herpes, right? And they take Valtrex or some viral suppressant daily, to keep from having outbreaks. So the way it works now is every 3 or 4 months, depending on how nice the doctor is, they have to go back in physically to take a visit, so that the doctor can bill insurance for his office visit, $120 to $140, depending on what billing code he uses. That patient has to spend the time making an appointment, drive to the office, sit in a waiting room, go through, the emotional process of facing the receptionist, the nurse, the doctor, and then go physically pick up his medication in most cases, right? Every 3 or 4 months. I mean, that's ridiculous. Where that can be replaced with a little automated asynchronous questionnaire like we have in the app to prescribe STD testing. It takes them 2 minutes while they're watching the news, saves the emotional impact, and we bill insurance at a $40, telemedicine visit. So we just took $100 every 3 months for 30 million people out of the cost of healthcare. I mean, and that's just a sliver of a sliver of a sliver, of what that can be applied to. And I think data is the, access to that data fluidly is the fundamental foundation of that.
Andre, what is your organization's current involvement with Carequality, and how do you see Carequality help with this?
FHIR? Yes, so I see several, just to add what Ken mentioned. As Carequality, FHIR work groups, and community in the broad term develops the implementation guide for FHIR, I'm pretty sure that there will be certain extensions to the existing FHIR resources, and potentially new resources will be introduced. So what I'm looking forward to is that those extensions and custom resources are committed upstream to HL7 organization, and they become part of the next FHIR version, just to support the whole industry. That would be awesome to observe. And the second thing, I'm very curious to see how the Carequality use cases like query initiation, documents retrieval, record locator, going to be implemented on top of FHIR resources and FHIR operations.
So, a couple of big topics there that are going to be part of the conversation. And Doc, you have been involved with the Tiger team to start to find out where to focus on and whatnot. And from your perspective there, what are some of the things that we can be looking at and that we would expect to come out of it?
Yeah, if folks read the report that we put together this summer, we had three pretty illustrative use cases, right? But if you look at the base of that is, okay, here's this use case for FHIR, okay? But how did I guarantee that the person that I was asking for data really was who they were, and how does the person who's being asked know that that's really who they are? And so how do you establish that through FHIR? So I think that's where I think Carequality governance and the framework that it already exists for document exchange will really speed up the advancement of FHIR use. I, as a vendor, am willing to share data with any other vendor here, but I don't want to do it one-on-one with each of you, right? And so I think that's where Carequality can really play the role.
Yeah, and it sounds like, and that's the way that the use cases intend to be set up is similar to the document exchange. How can we create a technical and a policy-oriented framework, and wherever possible point to existing implementation guidance like Document has done to the IHE stack. What are the appropriate ones for FHIR to work with? So on that note, wanted to start to shift a little bit to the audience and see whether there are some questions there in a couple of different ways. One just generally about FHIR, obviously, but also curious about your interest feedback into Carequality, moving into this FHIR implementation guide space, and if you have any particular areas that you say, well, it would be great if. I see the first hand up there, and I'm hoping that there are a few more lining up right after that. Microphone is on the way.
Thank you. So far, the discussion has been about end-user apps that are, very useful. But I think the discussion missed the power of FHIR. Have any of the panelists done any work with CDS hooks?
Say that again.
CDS hooks, Clinical Decision System. It's one of the features of FHIR. Right. When your EHR is FHIR enabled, through CDS hooks, you can run background apps that do things. And when those things happen, for example, in PDMP, Prescription Drug Monitoring Program, everybody's aware of that, right? So if you get that database, you got a database, so you got to look at it. You don't have intelligence. CDS hooks in a FHIR-enabled EHR will pop that database up, but you can go one step further. With Carequality, on that patient, you can query that patient health record coming from multiple sources, because no patient gets all their service in one hospital, right? We're all at multiple hospitals, clinics, etc. So that you can then run a little app that processes that patient health information against the PDMP database and give a comprehensive risk analysis on the PDMP. That's the power of FHIR and Carequality. So that's where we need to look at FHIR being extraordinarily useful, and linking it up with Carequality is going to have creative apps like I just mentioned and a whole lot more.
Eddie, anybody like to comment?
Yeah, I think clinical decision support is key to, I think, solving a number of things. And I know one of the speakers this morning talked about big data, the need, if we can get more of this data flowing, and we've got that data analyzed, right? And with FHIR, then you have the ability to do it very granular levels and automate. I know you're looking at smart on FHIR type things. We're looking at smart on FHIR type things. We've got a whole crew working on AI type functions, much like you're talking about. So it's all stuff we're doing. We're just not ready to really, I guess, talk much about it.
Well, you know, FHIR is more than
Yeah.
a format.
Oh, yeah, yeah, agree,
Instead of standardized APIs.
agree.
So instead of me worrying about what's the API from Cerner, what's the API from Epic, NextGen, if it's FHIR formatted, I simply use FHIR APIs.
Yeah.
And that's going to expand and grow the ability of creative apps in healthcare to be populated.
That's what, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Andre.
There are multiple use of FHIR. What seems like really useful for interoperability community here are FHIR subscriptions. This is when you can subscribe, for example, for lab results for a given patient, or like updates to the medical information that is available for the given patient. And then you don't need to like query and retrieve this data going forward, but you will be notified when something happens to this patient, when there is more information available. For example, blood result comes back from the laboratory. You get notified, you load it, and you load it into your decision support system.
And I'll get to you in a moment, Brad. On the note of CDS hooks, there's quite a few activity going on, different participants, at least for putting my company's hat on, very active in CDS hooks to define, develop it, and start to deploy it. And there's a couple of different areas that are very near term around appropriate use criteria. There is work starting to happen on how can we use CDS hooks to interact with the CDS mechanism. There is efforts going on in Da Vinci to do inquiries to a payer around prior authorization. It is clinical, it's administrative, it's financial types of opportunities that are out there to create that interaction. And I think I could go around the room here that there are at least a handful of different parties that are actively engaged in trying to figure that out, establish the standard, the open source software behind it. So it is clearly part of the opportunities of FHIR as well. And with that, I'll pass it to Brett with a question, comment.
Yeah, thanks, Hans. This is Brett Marquardt. I really appreciate, like my initial question was if you could pick one project FHIR related to work on, what would you be? And I appreciate you mentioned subscriptions. Part of the FHIR standard, there's a lot of facets to the FHIR standard, and some of them are still fairly immature. Subscriptions is one that if Carequality said we want to prioritize subscriptions, the potential to push the maturity of subscriptions through the roof would it move very quickly. There's been a couple connectathons, but that's an example of, I think Carequality has a very big opportunity here to say, here's a set of priorities that we'd like, that FHIR has started to work on and we'd like to push. So my question to the panel is, beyond subscriptions, if there were, what other things with, knowing the FHIR ecosystem, what other types of things would you like to see Carequality focus on?
I think it was mentioned during the previous panel, the power of FHIR is being able to query specific data attributes. You don't need to work with the whole document, right? You can query and retrieve only like specific, like list of allergies or just medications, or like specific blood test for the given patient. And yeah, so that decreases the load on the whole platform, since you don't need to load everything else.
Oh, sorry, to mirror that point, the fact that they're moving away from a solid document, the way we think about it, and sort of deconstructing the data into different blobs around the way that you typically use it. So I think one thing that as patients start, I think, giving up privacy for convenience, which we saw with media and a lot of other, sort of aspects that they've evolved to be okay with, I think as they start accepting that their data is moving around more and there's frameworks for their data to move around, access control, where you can say, okay, I'm going to this physician, I'm going to give him this part of my record. And maybe not even give it to him, but just give him limited access to it where he doesn't even have a copy of the data. I think the idea of FHIR figuring out some more data concierge type features would be pretty cool.
Yeah, I don't really have much more to add to that. It's the granular nature, right? I can do small chunks, pretty directed, right?
On that note is that something that documents exchange as we currently know it and FHIR based exchange, which can actually also be document level. It can be individual data, it can be documents, can be data sets, whatever. It is suited to do that. Likely, based on the green field that is out there, it might not as quickly move into some of the things that HL7v2 or CCDA documents have done, but that will happen over time. But they share some common challenges. Where's the patient? Record location, having endpoints to recognize, directories, etc. Where do you see the role of Carequality providing the assistance with that, whether it's document or FHIR, but particularly FHIR, to help improve on that? Are there particular areas that you're looking at and say this is a gap? This makes it very challenging for us to connect with everybody else that is unique to the FHIR space? Or is it really the same issue no matter whether it's the current document exchange or the FHIR exchange to get access to where is the patient's data? Where do I go? Is it the same issue and therefore we need to work together with that, or is there something unique out there?
Right. I know from our point of view, I don't see it as a lot different. I mean, obviously there will be differences, right? Document exchange and singular data element type exchange or resources are a little different, but fundamentally we're talking about does anybody know the A1C for Hans that was recorded yesterday, right? And to do that, I need to know where the FHIR servers are that might have a record of Hans, right? So I don't think it's any different than what we do with document exchange today.
Other questions?
Yeah, I can add to that.
Go ahead.
FHIR comes, like as part of the standard, comes with metadata endpoint that actually describes what the capabilities are exposed by this API endpoint. So I think it will be nice if like the directory of all the connections, Carequality connections, includes these metadata capabilities, so that the query initiator actually like knows ahead of time what kind of data can be retrieved, like list of allergies or only medications, for example.
I think that on physicians too, or clinicians, to have a more robust directory of actual providers, which I was surprised doesn't exist really anywhere, including the AMA, with accurate, up-to-date information. The payers probably are the ones that have the best data because everyone's keeping it up to date because they want to get paid, but I think that would be a nice thing to be included.
And on that point, it was actually a great conversation we had yesterday at the Carequality Steering Committee, where directory and how can that be enhanced to get more robust, more complete, etc. That was one of the very lively discussions and debates on how can we move that forward to get a richer directory set out there. So these are some of the points that would contribute to that as well, which is great. Any other questions before we are going to close out? Go ahead.
I want to extend the previous point. This is Kedar. We can create a directory of all the endpoints. We can see the metadata to see what the capabilities are. But the core piece here is how are we finding the patient? We still are relying on demographic match, name, date of birth, age, and so having a unique patient identifier that spans across the systems, which will eliminate all these inefficiencies, false positives, false negatives when you search for a patient.
Great question. I suspect, and I'm curious other reactions, is that whether we deal with documents, V2, otherwise, now FHIR, if we cannot match the patient, if we have a challenge with that, it will remain a challenge. And I'm kind of curious from your perspective, dealing with that and the interactions that you have you found any ways to make it easier because it's FHIR, or is it still the same issue that we have to figure out what's happening?
I don't know that it's any harder or easier.
Yeah, I don't see FHIR changes things. It's just another API to the existing master patient index processes.
I mean, I think you could, so we need to validate that this person is the person when they log on, so we don't have some paparazzi that knows a lot about Brad Pitt getting his STD records, right? And we're currently using KBA, which is just absolutely horrible, because you have to get their social security number, and most people don't remember those questions. It fails as many times as it works. So we're actually replacing it with a solution called Jumio now, and there's several of them that come out. They've become popular through the crypto wallets. And you actually take a photo of your driver's license and a selfie, and they do image recognition, facial recognition, and compare it. They have all kinds of techniques for validating that that's a real ID with the holograms that are now built into all of them. And that seems to me, if the big providers sort of mandated that, I mean, Epic and Cerner control what vast majority of the lives that are being managed digitally. So, you know, you proof traditionally going into a physician and they check your ID the first time until they get to know you, which is sufficient. So I think if the industry simply just moved towards what just naturally the crypto world is doing and people are now comfortable in mass doing, that could solve it. I also think if there was a way to capture streamed personal healthcare data. I think people are going to now, Apple just put out a big release. I think it's going to become very popularized. I think you're going to see a whole onslaught of mobile device-driven devices that will help capture different types of biometric data. And I think if Carequality and FHIR could find a way to be a method like it is for providers or EHRs to capture data, normalize it, and make it accessible to other places, I think that would be a very valuable thing to do that for consumers, right? And then you could stream your data into this company's AI, into this, you know, you could do all types of things with it once you had it, probably, you know, most likely in your Apple, you know, Health Kit or whatever. But once that was happening, you'd have a pretty reasonable, could make a pretty reasonable assumption that this is the person driven by their phone number, which is a unique identifier, and they're streaming data in that matches, you know, the rest of their health attributes or the other attributes in their patient records. So that might be a solution.
Great. Unless there are any other comments, I think we are at the point in time where I believe that Dave is going to take over and send us to break. In the meantime, thanks very much for your insight and perspectives, and have a great rest of the day.